So for the EOD recap here, what we're going to discuss is today's activity and then dive into the office hour stuff. And I have a few other questions that I have to answer. Wasn't able to get to, wanted to respect the OFL live NT trader aspect of that. And all fun to watch. These guys did a great job. But we've been balancing here just above previous week's value high, 54.27. So rotating around this and creating a Gaussian curve on the week to date. Therefore, if we are to build and hold above previous week's value high, I want to see us from the week plan push into 55.84. Absolutely. We've seen a lot of low volume and not a lot of excitement when we've gotten to these highs. We've also not seen a lot of excitement except for occasional liquidations that have been bought up and kept us in balance. And so I've been placing a lot of emphasis on the IB range, around pivot, even if we're rotating around pivot, just to be able to see what is occurring. And it's been extremely contracted. Now, with ES here, given that we've been balancing in this zone, tomorrow, if we are to maintain below the weekly open, then I would expect us to start to push in the direction of the weekly pivot down here at 52.25 3/4. We have had a lot of contraction. We will get expansion. Does it have to happen in the next session? No, it doesn't. However, be aware of this because we've gone from extremely wide ranges into pretty small ranges. And these ranges that are small right now are pretty normal from what we came into before that volatility last week, right? And so we need to be able to view this as mechanical and making live decisions, live reads on the profile against our MGI and tools at hand in order to step in, not only manage risk, but also push in and across the zone. And those zones are quite a bit smaller. However, not going to be there forever, right? So given that we have not been able to find too much interest up here, yeah, that gives me a lot of pause, especially on the long side. We're holding and balancing above previous week's value high, but I want to size down a little bit, take positioning and work it across the zone and not be afraid to step in on a counter move for a balance type trade in order to bring it back into that zone, right? If we are to step outside of range, so let's look at this from this perspective. So today on ES, right? And the red line is the premium VWAP, and it's a little bit different. It's some nuance to that OFL will provide, but talked about this area from 54.30s to 36 range, and we wind up opening above that. Not only that, is when we push up into these upper ranges, yeah, we slow it down, certainly. Get a liquidity event, and it gets bought up, certainly. Until this begins to auction and show that aggression to the downside, where does this change? And so that's going to be covered in some of the office hours content. But one thing I look to look at is this here. It'll be available soon. But when we begin to build below this here, that tells me, something has changed. We respect it the entire way up. Start to balance over it and build below it. And so it gives me a lot of pause as far as the inventory and their willingness to initiate up into the upper portion of this, which would be 55.15. Within Q, if you bought the pivot off the open, right on. I was looking for this pullback into the 940s down here from the overnight profile, And so definitely, I did not get on board with this through here. Took some scalps through this mix, did not short this through that. But when we found that liquidation, came down into this range here from the overnight session, looking at that prior activity, we found some bid activity, and that bid activity worked its way up and in, up and in. And then late day, what we do see is respect of this primary LVN at 1900s or 19,000s up in here, not able to find too much traction for a push down and in, down and in, down and in, but we're still in balance. And so a lot of nice two-way trade through this mix. So within Q, what I'm looking at here is if we're not able to step above the 19,000s, then I want to see us gravitate in towards the 18,415s right here, weekly pivot to gauge response. If we cannot bid out of the weekly pivot, I'd like to see us gravitate down towards the 17,900s to gauge response. If we're unable, or if we spend another night where it's small balance, and we're just rotating in this range, I want to be on edge to understand that I need to reduce size and understand when we escape a range, I don't want to counter that too quickly in order to get into a reversion type trade, because we can move quite a bit from that. This is pretty well contracted versus the prior week's activity. So one of the questions that I did not cover from office hours was this here. And the question was, and this is from Friday, based upon this activity, this person was not at their desk and it pushed up and out. Would you view this as an LVN return? And personally, I would not view this as an LVN return setup. However, I would view it as, hey, this is zone of initiation. It's not as clean as an LVN return setup. So therefore, pushing down into this, when you see this activity down in this manner, this is where I'd like to see multiple overlapping negative delta building up in that zone, inability to progress, and then pushing out of that zone. And it takes a little bit of time from that. Whereas an LVN return setup provides more of a kind of like what we saw today. Let me take a look at that. Kind of like what we saw today in this mix here. So we had this push up here. We push down and out, and then we come back in and test the high volume edge into that LVN, and it responds pretty much immediately. And that's more of what I'd look for with an exhaustive look for an LVN return. Whereas if we're spending a lot of time down there, it's not extremely well defined, then that would be that'd be more based upon the inventory coming in with your delta and so forth. When you read an LVN as it becomes eroded or invalidated, for instance, we push down into an LVN and it begins to fill and so forth. At what point is that off the table? So when you push down into an LVN or push up into an LVN, as long as the high volume edge on the opposite side is being respected and being responded to, and you're going to see this through delta, that initial response is to be utilized. And then during that time frame, you're going to have some transaction of activity, transaction of contracts, and it's going to build in that LVN. But once we move away from that zone, that's where it's off. And I know I covered that in office hours, but I want to just step on that one more time. And then let's see. I think that's it for the day. But I will go ahead and add on the recording from office hours in order to let anybody review that. And we'll be back on tomorrow morning for morning prep. So thank you for everybody who stepped on today for office hours and also for XYZs and the NT Live and, yesterday as well. NT Live has been excellent. So look forward to that continuing. This guy's been knocking it out. Okay, office hours here. We have a group of questions. First one being, and I didn't start recording when I started talking. I'm too long biased. I should probably be looking for shorts. When is continuation? When's two-way trade? When is reversal? And I want to incorporate some structure from the tools and so forth into this. Now, we've certainly been balancing on ES and NQ in a very tight range. ES is giving us this very good reference of this 54.27 area. And so you would expect that if we're holding this, we need to push and build into this untested weekly pivot. Given that we have not found any type of interest pushing up into that zone or pushing down and holding below previous week's 5-year low, as soon as we see initiation, we have to act on that. And acting on that means try not to, first off, try not to counter, right? But until we see that type of initiation, we can rotate back and forth. We have a Gaussian curve on the weekly basis. And so we'll zoom in here a little bit here. And I'm going to leave this red line up, and that is the premium VWAP I've been talking about. And this is something similar to like the balance zones. It's a no-brainer. We have this balance through here. I don't have to go back through and do the math, do that type of stuff. It's automation to keep me in check based upon direction, sentiment, and activity. And so in today's activity, in the overnight aspect, we talked about this 36, 32, 36 zone in here. We open up, we're holding above that, and yeah, we wind up coming back and testing that and held its way through this mix. But along the way, we had these liquidations from these highs. Does it mean since we're auctioning up into this area and holding that zone, does it mean that we cannot scalp into that? No, it doesn't. But what I was trying to convey to somebody earlier is that if we go ahead and on those moves to the upside, we wind up trying to short any type of pop there is coming up and out of zone, then you're going to find yourself in some trouble. And along the way here, yes, we did have absorption into these areas. And each time we rotated back into this, we saw sell side getting a little bit overzealous and getting absorbed for the next push. And you can see this reflected on the modified delta map. You can see it reflected on the delta map itself. But it wasn't until the close of the IB that we finally get a look at this. And so we get this liquidation. Did you miss it? If you did, who cares? We have a liquidation. We have an area of initiation, and therefore we also have references behind us in order to step in on and move against in order to reoffer this type of activity, of which is the 5-minute opening range itself. We tested down into some more levels from pre-market prep, and that was held twice, right? But as soon as we get this slice, instead of looking at this and thinking, are we there yet? Is this going to turn? As soon as we get that slice, first thought that comes through my head is two-way trade. All right, we have the ability to trade this two ways, and we have references on the current day's profile. We have references on the higher time frame aspects. We have references on the tools. And so from the higher time frame aspect, we did get an LVN return from this. If you took that, good on you. You got a nice move. If you did not take that, that's fine. Let it move, let it exhaust across the range, come into some sort of balance, and you can take this from two angles because A, we're holding some zones from pre-market. That's productive. And so it doesn't necessarily make me look at this and say, send it to zero. B, it says when we start to see an exhaustive look up into these edges of either the opening range, um, 5-minute opening range, or we were to come back up and into LVNs above us, then it's viable. It's viable. Whereas before, we weren't getting rotations that were coming back into prior distributions. So if you're somebody that has a tough time looking for when exhaustion occurs, and you'll start to identify this with delta and also with the tape reader and so forth, and maybe place on a little bit of size to see if you get a move instead of just wailing in on it. But once you get that move, then it unlocks the rest of the volume profile, those prior distributions, and you have a playground against, and like what we were talking about today, the IB low, 19,000 or 18,924s initially, versus up into the LVN just below the IB high. And so where along that range can you step in on in order to manage your risk appropriately, and what are you looking for? So after seeing a zone of acceleration like this, then simply what I'd like to see is your leg to leg delta building in. Let's say we're going to reoffer this. Your leg to leg delta building in a ton of buy volume, right? It's not really progressing too much at all. You get a ton of buy volume. You're going to have pull stack flips in that mix, but they're not making any progress to the upside as far as when you're leading into any type of absorptive event, then you're going to have a one-sided type of activity in response on the DOM. Generally, it's going to step up, step up, step up the ladder. When you finally get to an area where it's absorbing, you're going to have a little bit of two-way flip. And so as long as it's around a structural zone of interest, and you have to define that. I personally prefer the pivot balance zones, some of the weekly MGI, obviously the G line, the 5-minute opening range, the pivot, that type of stuff. If it's not responding or you're not getting that flip or that look with absorption, then by all means, you're not going to get a response. You'd rather be a little bit later to the party, allowing this range to extend up into here and let it gravitate in and really show its hand to get on board with any type of momentum than you would be to try to top tick or bottom tick that type of activity. When is reversal? And so I personally treat this on a session by session basis. And today with the current session, I talked about this in morning prep, was the 18,940s where we're currently at. And so what does that consist of? Well, this zone right here, right? Stepping into being that we're in such a wide pivot balance zone, and we have the possibility to push down into lower structure based upon the pivot balance zones, I need to have a reference somewhere here in the middle to give me an idea of where things are off. And until we are to build back inside of this from that overnight session, then inventory is not really off sides. In fact, it's doing just fine. You can get liquidations from it. You can get these liquidations and set up two-way trade and reoffer activity that leads us into that Gaussian type look on the volume profile. Until that's breached, then I want to assume that it's going to be mechanical for two-way trade. Now, if we look at the current volume profile, it's still Gaussian, right? But we're underneath this zone. So we have the potential to push down into the 18,777s into the middle of these two zones, the lower of which the high is at 18,679. And so if we do that, then this is the type of late day activity I would look for, something like this, creating an LVN and creating another build in this area, right? So forecasting, planning ahead, if we're holding below the IB low, I want to begin expecting this type of event. Testing outside of the IB low and just simply creating, and it's still a 45-degree taper, but simply creating a test, but coming back and auctioning around the IB low, I want to see this zone between the IB low and previous week's, or the current day's value low as an area where it can be accumulated and potentially push across that value. This is why a line in the sand for where things can flip is important. So these 940s, the IB low right here, keep it in check. Keep yourself on the right side of the tape. Give me 1 second here.
Rebidding the rebidding the primary LVN at the highs is where I get sliced through, right? So the issue, there's two opposite. These situations happen on both sides of the profile. What kills my PN, and thanks for taking the time, but what kills my PNL at the top end is I rebid the LVNs along the way and just get demolished, right? What happens here at the bottom is that I'm bidding, I'm bidding, I'm bidding, and eventually I get exhausted where I miss the move up, you know? So.
No, sure.
That's, and then, so that my thing's been just lock the hell out. I'm done. I'm done after A or B period. But still the issue is not necessarily that. The issue is I'm not seeing something right. At the end of the day. So
No, sure. So let's say we're bidding up into this today. All right. We have this distribution. Primary LVN is down here. Where do things change? Right there, right? We bring this out further. We're just building a distribution. Not only that, we have POC at the lower portion of that distribution at the lower portion of value, still supporting this type of activity being responsive and moving above. So liquidations into this, if you're not already positioned, got to be patient enough to let it move and rotate around this large node into that primary LVN for continuation. As we begin to push, what do? Push POC up into the upper portion of this. And then not only that, as we push this, anytime I see this, yes, early sign of potential exhaustion, but it has to give this back, right? It's got to give back this 19,118s. And then it does. And then it respects it. Did I take the short? No, I did not. What I'm getting at is leading into this, we didn't see this type of response. We saw respect of those low volume areas, creating distributions along the way. And I'm going to couple this with a different question, which was, um, well, there's two. When are you reading an LVN as eroded or invalidated, filling it in versus structure, and also push build? Can you describe push build? So the push build is more like this. So we push and build volume. And then even from this point, we test into that lower distribution. We don't accelerate. In fact, beeline up out of that sucker. And this is in the first few minutes of the market open, from which then we start to generate some really clear ideas of activity. So we have a build here, okay, primary LVN here and here. And so this is that wide LVN comment. If we're going to respect this immediately, I want to see some heavy negative delta into that, unable to progress. And I also have to size down because we're outside of a primary move. We're outside of the 5-minute opening range. We have the potential to pull back into the 5-minute or mid pivot, so forth. But in looking at this, now we have two. So we have this here, we have this here. And so the way you draw this distribution, and I'm trying to kill two birds with one stone here, is like this and like this, right? This in here is your, I guess you can call it your purgatory, right? Um, not too much going on in here. This is where we can fill. And so when you get a wide LVN and begins to fill, we're not able to test and hold into a lower distribution, then that tells me don't fade it, let it keep moving, right? And this works on the opposite side in that if we are to push down in and we begin to fill this out and we can't get back into this above distribution, all right, let's seek the lower distribution for rotation around to the opposite primary LVN and also consider what type of MGI references are closest to that. So even as XYZ was mentioning today on the fly, hey, based upon this activity, what would I like to see from this zone and this zone? I would like to see a response. And so he was expressing in the same way that I express, pull stack flip or this, that. He has an execution sequence. But when you get there, you need to see a response. You can map this out to the T and it can look like a Mona Lisa, but at the end of the day, if you're not able to utilize your planning, then you're not extracting. And so when we do dive into an LVN and we settle there and we begin to fill it out, I look at that as higher potential to come into the prior distribution. That's why with a wide LVN, one thing I like to just as a generic component, rule of thumb, if we don't respond right here immediately, I want to see if we respond here. That type of activity. I'm not worried about this in between. Where does it start? Where does it end? Here, here. And so when we look back at this here, pushes up, it builds in, oh, starts to respond. Okay, might have taken a stop. Where's it? Where's it back on the table? At the opposite side, right here. Where's it off the table? Outside of that, back into that prior distribution. And so as we build out, then we get it again. All right, this pushed up and out. Where are we going to respond? We don't respond. We push back into prior distribution. That there brings into play a reoffer scenario. And where can we go? Right here where we consolidated back across the board at the bottom of that distribution. So I don't want to take away too much from the NT Live today, but there are certainly 6 more questions that I need to answer. And I'll get those recorded and go through that. But at this point, if anybody else has any questions, let me know. I hope that answered your questions there, Blue.
Yeah, definitely helpful. Still, executing off of it. It's going to be a whole nother thing, but I appreciate the time.
Yeah.
Sorry to take up so much time with that
No,
question.
no, 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 it's
I'm sure
okay.
other people, I know other
It's
people are in the
very
same boat.
important. It's very important. So I don't want to miss that for anybody else because I'm sure we're going to have those questions in the future. Um, but
Oh, great.
utilization of buy sell zones, utilization of pinches, As far as the pinch goes, I believe that answer was quite, or that question was answered with the deep dive recently, but making judgment calls on week to week performance or higher time frame. The other one was a question from Friday, and so I'll just go ahead and record that as marker replay. Um, you read the LVN invalidated that we went through that. How to derive the concept of pushing and building, we got that. LVN near the lows this morning, slice through it. Um, we had an example from that sent, and I'll go ahead and record that separately, but let me go ahead and see if there are any questions at hand currently.
You can scratch that pinch request.
You
I
all set?
went
You all
through
set with that?
that. Yeah, just one thing.
Yeah.
Uh, it repaints a little bit. Is it by design or is it something wrong with is it motive specific issue?
Huh. Yeah, it shouldn't be doing that. If your charts are open 24/7, if you leave your computer on, you're going to see just a conglomerate of all of that. Then when you reload it, it's going to be based upon bar close.
Ah, okay. So some of the
Right?
pinches got removed when I restarted my motive.
Yes. But during a live session, you should be able to see that acceleration or deceleration into the pinch.
Okay, makes sense.
All
But
right.
just opening with the refresh, so I discovered that, and I'm in talks with Josh. So, for example, on the 1 minute or on the 30 second, and even on the tick one, so you get one, and then if you click on the study, you click update, then you see that this one disappears.
Because
Or
you're refreshing your chart.
or
Then
sometimes raising that.
instead of setting into the live scenario where the activity is slowing and turning, then based upon the replay aspect or that chart close aspect, it's going based upon the closing price or bar close.
Okay.
Yep. But I mentioned in the deep dive, time-based pinch is extremely beneficial. Be aware of that. That's why we talked about the 4 hour and the 5 minute and so forth. Um, but also the differences between this and um, something like the dominator, the EAD, that type of stuff, is that it's showing you deceleration. And so when you see deceleration, you see lack of interest. When you see lack of interest, you want to begin to shift your eyes back to your profile in order to gauge zones of potential return or entry. Okay. And so if you're already sitting short and you get a pinch setting up on your chart, then you wanna step in and look at this and say, I need to take some profit. It's slowing down, that activity slowing down, and then it pushes back a little bit. Does that mean that is a long trade? No, it just means it's decelerating. The interest is slowing down, and we can rotate back and across that distribution. So showing the speed of activity. And speed of activity plays plays a role even into our earlier questions where we were talking about this morning, where we're pushing, we weren't making much progress, and we're decelerating. And I know that blue had an inverse pinch. Well, I can tell you that shouldn't be too long, but we should have a dual form of this pinch showing both sides, and that will help show that type of lack of interest. And that's pace of price activity versus volume. And so when you're talking about the auction, you're talking about price, volume, and time. And so price activity, how much progress is it making, how much volume is it building, and how much time is it spending there trying to do it. And that's what we read against any of these tools, right? Anytime we're looking at structural aspects or planning, that's what we're looking at to say, hey, inventory is either stuck here, we want to see rebid activity, reoffer activity here, or we want to step in on this because we have a ledge and that's unfinished and there's more interest up in that area, that type of response.